Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Deb Engel-Collin, and you're with B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU. We're going to start in just a minute as I let the participants into this room. We are really thrilled to be with you this afternoon, this lovely Monday. We're at 240 participants coming. We have over 540 signed up, so we're going to give it a little bit, another minute or so to let people come in. Very exciting this afternoon. Again, my name is Deb Engel-Collin. I am the relationship manager for the Miller Introduction to Judaism program here at American Jewish University. And you're with B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU. This platform, this digital platform, was created as our answer to the pandemic to create opportunities for learning, online learning in all sorts of subjects, arts, science, philosophy, anything to really bring thought-provoking questions to our audiences. And we say we don't always have the answers, but we have a lot of questions. For those of you who don't know, American Jewish University is just a gem in the middle of Los Angeles. And we also have a campus in Simi Valley, Brandeis Bardeen. We house the Miller Introduction to Judaism program, which I told you about, the Ziegler School of Rabbinics, our graduate programs in education, and a nonprofit management, as well as the Moss Center for Jewish Journeys. And this afternoon, actually, I am delighted to be in conversation with Ayala Fader. I got it right before, and now I'm like going to blank on this. And this is part of our conversations this week that we're having about Hasidic life. And Ayala received her PhD from New York University and is currently professor of anthropology at Fordham University. She is the author of the award-winning book, Mitzvah Girls, Bringing Up the Next Generation of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. And the National Science Foundation and National Endowment for Humanities supported her latest book, Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age. Ayala is the co-founder and co-convener of the New York Working Group on Jewish Orthodoxies at Fordham's Jewish Studies program. And I am thrilled to be in conversation with you today, Ayala, about your book. Again, I just enjoyed it. For those of you who can see here, I was taking notes all the way through. I felt like I was back in university studying, and in the chat function, we do have where you can buy the book with a discount code as well. For our audience members today, we are going to be using the Q&A function for questions today. So the chat function is disabled to the audience, but it is, we will be taking questions in the Q&A. So Ayala, why don't you start and just tell us how you came to the title of the book, first of all, Hidden Heretics.
Thank you so much, Deb, and I'm really grateful to be here today. So initially, my book was actually titled Double Life, because the subject of the book are people who have a crisis of faith and they stop believing, but because they're married and have children, almost all of them, they're reluctant to leave their communities and to hurt their families. So they continue to practice publicly while they start to explore a whole other world. So they live a double life. Some of the people I worked with didn't like the term double life so much. They felt it had duplicitous connotations. And one of them recommended that I think about the Yiddish term Behalten Apikorsim. I hadn't really heard that so much. So I was quite intrigued with that. My book is not only about Hasidic Jews, it's about ultra-Orthodox Jews, so Hasidic and Yeshivish. But I was really intrigued by that idea of heretics hidden in plain sight. And so I chose that term. Throughout the book, I use the term double life, and sometimes people themselves use the term reverse Moranos or even ITC in the closet.
Interesting.
If we show the cover again, I'm sorry to interrupt. If you show the cover again in very tiny letters, you can see that Behalten Apikorsim is written in Yiddish, sort of hidden in the cover.
Yes, I saw that. And it wasn't until I went into the inside jacket that I actually could read what it said.
Right.
It was interesting. And it's interesting that they use ITC. I wonder if they know that people who are LGBTQ say that they're in the closet and they come out of the closet.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a play on that.
Oh, interesting. I hope that our audience will go and get your book. It's in the chat function. You could see where you can get it, because there are a lot of hidden things within the hidden things. It's very Purimish, if I could go that way.
That's true.
So one of the questions I have, and I think maybe our audience would be interested, is that you're an ethnographer, and it's the study of ethnography. And you're an anthropologist, but you bring it up a lot in the book. So if you could explain, what really is the study of ethnography?
Sure. So ethnography, there are some sociologists who do qualitative work who are ethnographers too, but ethnography is really definitive of the methodology of anthropology. And it's basically participant observation, which means that you participate and you observe, and it's always longitudinal, which means that it's over a long period of time. So I did my research from about 2012, 2013 to 2019. So that's a long time. And that's what makes ethnography simply a collection, not simply a collection of anecdotes. What happens over time is, as you build relationships to people, and it's really about building relationships to particular people, you start to see patterns again and again. And actually ethnography these days, contemporary ethnography, also includes historical work. Some people work in archives. There's historical ethnography. And ethnography happens in all kinds of places. As I did my own work, I followed people online, and I follow people offline too, in person. And so there's no particular place that people do ethnography. It's more of a method. You know, more traditionally, anthropologists went far away and did studies with far off peoples, but that has really changed in contemporary anthropology. And so I do research actually in the city in which I live, which is in New York. And I do research with people who are not the same as me by any stretch of the imagination, but who share a kind of a Jewish background, at least to some extent. And that's part of anthropology these days also.
So fascinating to me. Really, I thank you for clarifying that for me and for our audience. So you mentioned that you talk about, they have this double life because they have a life-changing doubt. These people in the ultra-Orthodox communities, both Yeshiva and Hasidic, and we might want to define that for our audience too, the difference. But then can you also tell me how life-changing doubt is different than a doubt that you or I might have about something, anything?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I would start by saying that doubt is really inherent to all religions. And in some ways, doubt really defines faith. It's expected. It ebbs and flows over the life cycle. That kind of doubt usually remains in interiors of people, of individuals. And, you might seek out help. A rabbi or a priest might guide you in that, but it doesn't actually change what you do necessarily. What I was studying was what I call life-changing doubt. And that was the kind of doubt that refused to stay inside. And it led people to disrupt or to actually stop their religious practice. Often this kind of doubt makes people leave. People I worked with often talked about cognitive dissonance. It's just too difficult. But the double lifers that I was working with couldn't leave. They felt both too responsible for their families, for their children, and they didn't want to hurt them. And they also felt unprepared to live outside their own communities. So they stayed. And I guess the most dangerous part of the life-changing doubt that I write about was that it refused to stay inside individually. And because social media, first blogging and then social media, was really exploding at the same time, people began to go online and find each other. There's nothing new about living a double life, but the fact that people could find each other anonymously online was really powerful. And they began to create these networks of doubters, which then met in person also. And then I guess finally I would say life-changing doubt is not just an individual change, but that there are family and communal implications. So even when that kind of life-changing doubt is kept secret, it affects spouses and children and extended families. And over the time period that I was doing research, it also drew attention from religious leadership and therapists and, outreach rabbis, people who tried to help.
So we're gonna get to some of those points later in the conversation. Let's get back to, if you want to explain the difference between yeshivish and Hasidic.
Yes. So I use the term ultra-Orthodox. That's a kind of controversial term. Some people use Haredi, that comes out of Israel. But there are two different strands of Orthodoxy that came out of Europe since the war, since World War II and relocation to the States and other places. Those two branches, Yeshivish and Hasidic, which initially had, very different, were actually pitted against each other. One, Yeshivish is organized around a yeshiva, has very different modes of learning, and the Hasidic movement was inspired by mystical texts, has a very different social structure around a Rebbe. Be that as it may, post-war, those two groups have moved closer together. There are significant differences. Hasidic Jews speak Yiddish, Yeshivish Jews don't. They usually speak English. Men continue to study in yeshivas. Hasidic Jews continue to be organized around rebbes. But for two reasons, I decided to just use the term ultra-Orthodox. The first is that in a lot of my work, these two groups actually were together. I was trained to sort of see these distinctive groups from my reading and my previous research, and instead there were friends who were yeshivish and Hasidic, and there would be yeshivish therapists coming to help a Hasidic person with life-changing doubt. So I had to follow what was actually happening on the ground. And the other reason is methodological, which is that I had to really maintain people's anonymity more than usual, I would say, because people were living with secrets and I could not reveal those. And so I decided to not name whether a person was Hasidic or yeshivish, or to just say Hasidic and never say which group they belong to. So I tried to be as kind of vague as I could.
Yes, certainly that it came across in your book how important it was for you to keep the confidence and the privacy of the people who allowed you to interview them. I think it was interesting. I think one of your people who said, were you just hanging out or were you always studying them? I thought, right? Yeah. You were studying them. You were there to do a job.
Yeah, but that really, that's such an interesting point, because that really speaks to some of the ethical implications of ethnography, which is that you're doing both. You're creating intimate friendships and you're hearing about people's intimate lives and you're hanging out with them. It wasn't just interviews. I went to parties and bars and out to concerts and stuff. And I was doing research, but I was also I admired the people I worked with, all of them. And I enjoyed my time with them. And it's an interesting question. I don't think there's a good answer to that. Are you ever just hanging out? No, not really. And yet I feel like your friend, it's a complicated relationship.
I would imagine. In fact, one of our audience members is asking you what caused you to get involved in researching this subject?
Oh, that's interesting. I had just finished my first book, which was a study of actually why young girls and women grow up and decide to stay, and not decide to stay, but what makes it so powerful for them to stay in their communities. And I thought I had just one more paper in me. And I was very curious about these Hasidic bloggers that I had been hearing about that had not been around when I began my initial research. So I set up a few interviews, and I suddenly learned about this whole community of people who had these huge life-changing doubts, but who were remaining in their communities. I hadn't known about them at all. I'm sure they were around when I was doing research. I had just been, in kindergarten classes. And so, and around that same time, the 2012 rally against the internet happened in Citi Field Stadium in Queens. And, where 40,000 men, ultra-Orthodox men, Hasidic and Yeshivish gathered. Rabbis spoke to them about the need for not necessarily outlawing or banning the internet, but using filters and how dangerous the internet was. And there were all different kinds of speeches about what the internet could do. And it just seemed to me like ultra-Orthodoxy was changing. Like there was a real moment here, and I knew I had to follow that. I was so curious.
I found it fascinating, the different blogs and how they had different ways of speaking and different, they were, I'm gonna bring it to a different question, because part of that and the blogs was more open to men.
Yes.
And many things you write in the book is really gendered in terms of subtle differences of semantics, or how they lived their lives, or how they were able to explore because of different freedoms for men and women who had life-changing doubts. So can you address a little of that, please?
Sure. Yes. In my first book, I only spent time with women and girls, almost no men. When I started doing this research, I realized I was almost exclusively talking to men. Men in their 20s and 30s. And I was curious, like, where are the women living double lives? And I found a number, but what I learned in the process was that it's much harder for women to live double lives. Not that they don't have life-changing doubt, many do, but structurally, there are lots of reasons that men can live quite vibrant double lives and women can't. The first is that at the moment of marriage, and it's quite young, like people in these communities get married like 18, 19, 20, men's independence and mobility it widens, like suddenly no one's watching where they are or what they're doing. They might be in Colo learning a little bit, but they have a lot of free time. I used to meet a circle of men who hung out in the Barnes & Noble in Brooklyn, and they were just having coffee and chatting. It was very relaxed. But once a woman gets married, in fact, and hopefully the hope is that she has children immediately, her life is really constrained in terms of she should be at home and she's in charge of the house. She's watching the kids. In some communities, women aren't allowed to drive. If they live in a kind of suburban area, they're not going to be going out and even taking the subway into the city, which now seems like a distant dream, right? Is just not as acceptable. And women often socialize, of course they have friends, but they socialize at home, whereas men have all these public spaces that they can actually socialize and interact. And that got mirrored, I would say, online as well, where men were more vocal on the blogosphere and then on social media. They would post long posts and have lots of discussions. Women were involved in those too, but there were many fewer bloggers. And then the women who were active online that I followed, at least, were in smaller groups, men and women mixed together, but in smaller groups, equal intellectual engagement. And a lot of the women that I spoke to did have intellectual crises of faith, meaning that they would be reading, they always had questions that were not answered. They would be reading a text at home, usually online, actually, or in their office job. And suddenly they would realize, oh, what I've been told is the truth is actually one interpretation of Jewish law or Jewish text. And so there were many women like that. There were some women also who were disappointed in their married lives and couldn't understand why they wanted more. So men and women had similar responses in some ways to that life-changing doubt, but their actual opportunities were much more constrained. And in fact, many men were devastated when they lost their faith. A lot of the women I talked to were angry that they had given up some of their dreams for what they believed was a kind of personal sacrifice. Everyone makes certain kinds of compromises and personal sacrifices, but they made certain personal sacrifices, and when they stopped believing in what they called the system, they felt angry that they had made those.
So it's really interesting that you just brought up the system, because one of our audience members wanted to know, when they had life-changing doubt, what was the doubt exactly? Was it in the community and the lifestyle, or the validity of the Torah as a whole?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
That was for my son, by the way. I'm going to out him.
It's a really important question too, because I had certain assumptions. I assumed actually that life-changing doubt was about belief in God, but it wasn't. So what I heard almost exclusively was that life-changing doubt was about a loss of faith in the divine revelation at Mount Sinai through Moshe, right? That God actually gave the Torah to the Jews through Moshe, and that the Torah is God's words. So once that piece fell away, it was very hard for many people that I talked to then continue to follow all the interpretations of Jewish law, especially given that they had gotten so increasingly stringent since World War II. It was increasingly difficult to follow those. And at the same time, I do have to say, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, there were this kind of life-changing doubt and communal concerns about it were happening in a broader context where there were a lot of changes and dissatisfactions going on. The community is growing exponentially. There's no doubt about that, but there is a lot of concern within the community, from leadership especially, about too many people with either life-changing doubt or who either live double lives or who leave. And a lot of them focused around the internet as a big threat to that. What was really going on, I think, was that there were lots of social, political, economic changes and dissatisfactions. And there was a generational moment where especially men were saying, why do I have to abide by these stringencies? Why do I have to not go to college? For the Hasidic especially, how come I hardly speak English? How can I support my family? What is the sexual abuse crisis? How come I'm watching all these rebbes struggle over power and who's going to lead them, and seeing all these schisms of my community? So there were a lot of broader, I would say, sociological issues going on. And the life-changing doubt, so they actually rejected that theologically, but that came with it a lot of critique of the system that was going on at the same time. So really those were happening together. The doubt was about the theology, but very closely allied to that was a critique of the system, especially the school system and how it was tied to rabbis and their ability to pressure families to do certain things.
Well, that you had a whole section about the when it came to the internet and the men who weren't willing to uphold the smartphone. Like there was a thing, you shouldn't have smartphones, or it should only have filters. And then they went to the women to take care of it and to do it. That was fascinating to me. And then, oh, well, it's the women's place to keep the spiritual life in the family. And that was also interesting to me. One of the things that what happened is you talk about when they were found out, or if someone told somebody, there's a whole system then that was designed to help these people, that they realized that, help, I would say that might be a stretch of the word, but that they created this whole situations of the rabbis and spiritual therapists or religious therapists, some who didn't even have training to help these people. Can you talk a little bit about how that kind of came about?
Yeah. The kind of embrace of psychology and therapy is quite recent in the ultra-Orthodox communities, and I would say plural, but yeshivas were much, because they have more access to higher education, there were more who were well-trained and had degrees. But when somebody was found out, either they confessed to a spouse, or when somebody discovered, there's a sense that you are not in this alone, that there are other authorities and sort of hierarchies of authority who you should go to for help. So even when someone privately experienced a serious kind of doubt, they would do outreach. They would reach out to either their rabbi or a rebbe or a counselor. What I did discover was that there was often, I wouldn't say often, there was sometimes a kind of triangulation of care, and within the community, a kind of figuring out of where therapists fit in with rabbis, because rabbis often blamed the internet for life-changing doubt, but therapists didn't. And there's a whole group of religious therapists who are reputable and trained and professional, but there were also some therapists who were too invested in keeping people religious. And they would work with rabbis, again, not always the norm, but they would sometimes work with rabbis. And some of the people living double lives, I heard it enough times that it seemed that this was a real complaint, where they would talk to a rabbi who would recommend a therapist, and the therapist would then share some of the information with both the extended family and the rabbi, so that the confidentiality issue was not in place. And there was a pathologizing of religious doubt in terms of, it was very difficult for the communities to understand how somebody who had grown up and experienced the beauty of frum life could still have these questions. That was a real conundrum. And so some of the answers that some people, especially people who were less trained, maybe life coaches and therapists who didn't have any training or their formal degrees, would say, well, maybe there was some kind of, you know, either abuse or there was some kind of damage done to this person, so that there was a kind of quick fix, sometimes a diagnosis that wasn't accurate. I talk about Javi in the book, who was diagnosed with a disorder that she did not have and prescribed medication, which really did much more damage, when in fact she was anxious and depressed, which is not surprising. I think life-changing doubt, any kind of, you know, experience that turns your moral world upside down, is going to be really hard to deal with. And then she found a Jewish non-Haredi therapist who was really helpful for her, and she worked things out. But that's one of the dangers, is that religious doubt like that can get pathologized because it's sort of incomprehensible. I do also in the book talk about a convention that I attended where a number of modern Orthodox and yeshivish therapists, I was really interested to see this, began to sort of present, well, we don't really know why someone has these kinds of doubts. We don't know why they have what are called iminakashas, or questions of faith. And that kind of not knowing, I think, is a real change. And there's other changes going on. There's a small group of religious therapists who are telling parents whose children have left, who have gone OTD or off the derech, you know what, put your relationship with your kids above your religious beliefs, and don't break off ties, because that used to be what they were told. Right. You know, your child leaves, you sit Shiva for them and it's over. And now there's a movement. It's small, but it has religious support from some corners. And there are parents who are saying, no matter what you believe, you're still my child. So I'm hopeful that these kinds of dynamics are changing. But it definitely was a problem for some of the people living double lives. And they relied on therapy in a lot of ways, both to negotiate with their spouse, but also for their own sanity. Because one of the things that people told me right away was, the internet is so important for me because I see other people who agree with me who are not crazy. I was scared I was crazy, that there was something mentally wrong with me.
So I can't even imagine. You mentioned just now the moral question. So I want to go to that, because that's really central. I think a central theme of the book is this moral and ethical question that these double lifers have, who, because they're not OTD, which is off the derech, which is people who actually leave the ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic lifestyle, and either, you know, they may become, you know, they can go anywhere. There's so many different places. Some of them put it all away. There are places that someone asked about, Footsteps, which is an organization who helps those people. But these are people who actually stay in the community, and outwardly you wouldn't know. Well, maybe there might be a small change in if they have a hat on top of the wig. I mean, I think it's interesting how they give little symbols outwardly that they were questioning. But really, there's a whole question of these ethics of people who are living double lives, and then how it affects the family and the children. So let's get into that a little.
Okay. I would just frame this whole conversation really as, theoretically, in terms of anthropology, my goal was to move the study of ethics beyond the individual, and to really think about, exactly as you say, how ethics happen in families. When somebody is living a double life, they are actually developing a second set of values, a whole other moral system. They often draw on liberalism. I mean, that's not surprising. They live in American society. So they draw on things like free choice, the value of individual fulfillment, an idea of an authentic self, things that many people who grow up in the States are familiar with. But those values really clash with what they experience at home. I think one of the toughest things is living a double life with your partner, because not only do you have to keep secrets from the person you're most intimate with, but there are consequences if you share that with your spouse, that they also have to lie for you. And in some cases, especially for women, they have to take on certain kinds of spiritual responsibilities for the family that they don't feel is their role and that they don't want to take on. So, you think, well, oh, their women's religious authority is expanding in those cases. Their husband can't make Kiddush on Shabbat, so they will make it. But in fact, that was a sign that something was wrong in their families. And so that was a real, it was really confusing. I don't want to spoil my own book, but one of the women, spoiler alert, one of the women that I begin with, I then end with, and I found her situation so poignant. She said, I'm thinking about the Garden of Eden, that concept of heaven that many people, and I want to be there, but will my husband be there? I mean, there's a lot, and who can I tell? I can't tell anybody in my family about the kinds of burdens that I'm carrying forward, and we're not as close anymore. We have different things about what's right and what's not right. So I think that was really, really tough on a lot of couples. It was also really tough on children, especially as kids got older. I do talk about the kinds of small interventions, you might say, that mothers in particular might make with their kids, like don't call the Gentile cleaning lady the goita, that's feminine boy, right? Use her name, it's more respectful, everybody's a human being. So that kind of idea of pluralism and tolerance, subtly trying to spoon feed that in with the cholent, so to speak. But at the same time, one of the things that really struck me was that double life parents just wanted their kids to have a choice. And choice is not a neutral term either, right? It's a liberal concept coming out of the Enlightenment, and it's one that people grew up with in the States, but they wanted their children to have a choice. If their children chose to stay religious, fine, in some ways even better. But if they didn't, they would also feel that they had provided this choice. What was really tricky was once kids became older, once they were teenagers, and I was fortunate enough to talk to one teenager and spend some time with her, and she was really angry. She was angry that she had figured out that her mother was not what she should be, that she was not a typical Hasidic lady. And she was very open about saying to me, I know what you're doing. You're writing a book. I mean, I told her, but she said, the reason I want to talk about this and I want your readers to know is it's confusing to us, the teenagers. And she gave a very mixed message. She was a young 16-year-old. And she said, I had to choose that I was going to be very, very religious. I had to choose it for myself, and it was confusing, and I'm not going to be like my mother. I'm going to have a completely frum life. And I realized, like, that's also a choice. That's what your mother really wanted. And in some ways that's what happened, but it was very difficult for her.
I felt for the kids and for the spouses, because you actually interviewed a spouse of someone who lost their faith. To me, that was the most painful, I think, anecdote to read, because they didn't have the choice. Right? They, all of a sudden, their spouse is telling them, I don't believe anymore.
Right.
But I still love you. I still want to be in relationship with you, but this is who I really am.
Right.
And then all of this burden, which you mentioned, that came on her, that to me was really very, very difficult to read. I mean, it really was painful.
It was painful to meet those people. I will say, again, gender played a key role. Like, women had far fewer choices. Men were often given the choice or the advice by their rabbis, you can get divorced. Women were often advised to just stay with their families, do the best you can, do everything. One woman I spoke to, a different woman who actually a neighbor sent her to Israel to consult, the highest rabbis there. And they were like, just do everything, make everything lovely for your husband. No stress on Shabbat or anything, and you keep up the level of religiosity in the home. And she said, I can't do that. I have to choose either my marriage or my level of religiosity, and I choose my marriage for my children. So pulled in ways that, yes, absolutely they hadn't chosen. And for men, which I was fortunate that I talked to a husband whose wife had had life-changing doubt as well. It was publicly humiliating for him in a very different kind of way, where people said, how come your wife, what's going on with your wife? Like, why is she doing that? Why did she change her stockings suddenly? You know, or where's her hat on her wig? That's what our family does. What do you mean she just took it off? So it was not only a theological dilemma and an emotional dilemma, it was also a kind of publicly humiliating dilemma. And they were lucky that they were able to separate amicably and now work together to raise their kid.
Wow. My name is Deb Engel-Collin. I am with Ayala Fader, and we are on Beyachad Together, Spirited by AJU. I'm going to go to some questions now from our audience because we've got a lot of them. Someone wanted to know if your subjects, if they knew they were subjects from the beginning of your relationship. So I know you mentioned it in the book that they all had to sign something, but if you wanted to, how did you, I'm interested in how you found some of the subjects and why they would agree to speak to you.
Yeah, that's
because
also
we had another question. How did you get them to talk?
Yeah, those are great questions. One of the tenets of anthropology, any kind of anthropology, is that you have to be ethical in your dealings with people. So you always there's no undercover investigative reporting. You have to always tell people what you're doing. So I introduce myself that way. I'm a professor at Fordham, and I'm writing a book about people living double lives. What really intrigued me was I had really not much trouble getting people living double lives to speak with me. So I used a regular, what is called a snowball sampling technique, meaning I found one person who had already left, who knew somebody who was still in the community, who introduced me to somebody else. And from there, it was easy to say, can you introduce me to somebody else? So that wasn't difficult. What fascinated me was people were not reluctant to talk to me. I mean, everyone emphasized I had to keep their identities a secret. And that took a long time to figure out how to do. I did have what is called informed consent that comes from my university, where they sign, and many of them didn't want to use their name, so they put an X, but just so that they knew that they had recourse if they wanted to pull out at any time, or if they wanted to contact my university. That's what informed consent is in a university context. But many people I spoke to said it was a relief to talk to me. I had to remind people numbers of times that I was not a therapist. I was not able to advise in that way, but I think that narrating their lives was a relief to somebody who was outside the community, who had no stakes and who was sympathetic, because I was sympathetic to their plight. I mean, it takes strength to do what they're doing. And so as long as I could maintain their anonymity, people were willing to talk to me. There was one time where I made a mistake and I wanted to give somebody credit for something. And I used their name by accident, and I never spoke to that person again. It was a mistake, and I learned from that. It's hard to keep secrets. And especially in field work. Yeah, but especially in field work where you kind of build on what different people tell you and say like, well, this person told me this and that person told me that. But I couldn't do that. I learned not to do that. And people told me that, like, don't use that name. Don't say things like that. So I was kind of taught how to keep secrets better. It's not my strength still, but I work on it. What surprised me was that life coaches and certain rabbis were much more reluctant, and more informal therapists were much more reluctant to talk to me. I think, as one of them said, there's a whole category called outreach rabbis who use techniques designed to bring Jews into the community, but to use those same techniques of argumentation and logic on people who are doubting, who are born in the community. Those are called kiruv rabbis or outreach rabbis. Very reluctant to talk to me. They told me very frankly, like, we don't know what kind of book you're going to write. Is it going to be like in honor of God's name, or is it going to be not? They wanted to know if I was Orthodox. They figured out immediately from the phone call that I wasn't. They asked me what work my husband did. That was the giveaway. He works in TV. So, you know, that was an unexpected kind of wrinkle. But eventually, what I have learned in ethnography is that, you know, with time, you can always find somebody who's willing to talk to you. People who talk to me have their own reasons for doing so. I didn't have to convince anyone. I can't force anyone. So people come who are interested in talking. I will say also that a lot of people living double lives are autodidacts, and they were interested in talking to a professor. They had read my first book. Some of them came with just the same number of your sticky notes in my first book to tell me where I made mistakes and where I was correct. And so they're intellectuals. So they were curious to talk to another intellectual, I think, if I can call myself that.
Well, I would think so, which is interesting because one of the questions many of our audience members have asked a similar question is, could you see, what did all these doubters have in common? How did they lose their faith? What caused them to doubt the Torah? And I think you touched on it, intellectualism, no?
Yeah, a lot of it is that. I mean, there are people, there's a whole other category called the tuna bagel, or if you're Hasidic, the tuna bagel, which is somebody who doesn't follow religious law, the stringencies of halacha, because they want to have a good time and it's burdensome and they're curious about, quote unquote, secular culture. So they violate commandments and maybe they don't look as appropriate, women's skirts are too short, men gel their payas or whatever and tuck them up under their hat. Those are not the people I was talking to, right? Those are their own category. And neither was I talking to what people call at-risk Jews. That is, people who have had some kind of traumatic experience in the community and who are either using drugs or sometimes using drugs and not keeping the Sabbath is sort of conflated, but that's a younger category. Usually those are kids at risk. I wasn't talking about those either. I was really talking to a subset of ultra-Orthodox Jews who had intellectual questions, who were usually people who like to read, who were curious. And it's not that there's no place for those people in their communities. There's lots of places. I mean, ultra-Orthodox Judaism can be a very intellectual community. You can love learning. And in fact, a lot of the people I know, the men in particular who left, still continue to learn sometimes because it's such an enjoyable, one man told me, he said, now that I know I don't believe, that I think that the Torah is made by people, I love learning even more because I like to look at it as a historical document and it's really interesting for me. But in general, I would say these are people who had intellectual questions, but that separation between intellectual and emotional, I found really false, actually. People told me that a lot, but I don't buy that. And I think what happened to a lot of people was, there are lots of intelligent people, obviously, among the ultra-Orthodox, but sometimes those questions, those intellectual questions that are unanswered are less relevant if you're happy in your life. Everybody, again, makes compromises. And if you're in love with your spouse or you're really satisfied with what you're doing, okay, you'll allow for certain questions to just sort of rear their head sometimes, but not change your life altogether. What all of this whole group shared, and they were really a network of friends to a large extent, not all, but the central people, the main characters, was that at the moment where their lives were supposed to be getting more and more ernst or serious religiously, their questions returned and they couldn't find answers to them, and it bothered them so much, and they found this online community that validated it. Because before, if you had those kinds of life-changing doubts, and many people have, beginning with probably Spinoza, right, and all the way on up, you had to leave your community in order to find people like yourself. What the internet allowed was for you to stay in your community much more easily and find other people to socialize with, to go out with, to explore the city with, to learn how to ride a bike with, to practice English with, and read all kinds of books and practice Yiddish and learn how to write in Yiddish in new kinds of ways. And that was really something new, again, in the context of this generational moment, that people were dissatisfied, that the old ways weren't working as well.
And I think you even mentioned in the book that maybe the rabbis were right about some of their concerns of the internet, because it did, it allows so much questioning and anonymity in terms of being able to go out there and to really question. We have quite a few.
Can I just add one more thing?
Sure, please.
I think that the questions that rabbis asked, and there's actually a really interesting review of my book, not review, but in conversation with my book in the foreword recently, the questions that they were asking about the internet are questions that we all ask, right? Like any parent is concerned that their children are online, that it's anonymous, that it's dangerous, that they're going to be exposed to bad things. These are questions we all share. I don't think the answers that the rabbis gave and the kinds of limitations that they set up are the answer for most people. That was their culturally and religiously particular answer. But these are questions that everybody shares.
It's humanity, right? It brings us to the humanity of all of that. We have, Ayala, quite a few questions from our audience members here about the how is this different than some of the recent movies and TV shows, and other questions, whether it be shtisel, unorthodox has come up here quite a few times, trembling before God, which, well, that's quite a few years old and actually dealt specifically with homosexuality. So how do you feel those shows are representative of the communities?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question too. I get asked a lot about unorthodox, and I would say maybe that character of Moishi, the kind of hitman, the Hasidic hitman, is most similar to living a double life. I don't think he is, and I wouldn't really compare him at all, but he shows the kind of unexpected flexibility that happens in ultra-Orthodox communities where people come in and go out and come in and go out. I really hadn't expected that. I was surprised to see that rabbinic leaders would tolerate, even in very small kind of gated communities, would tolerate someone they knew was a heretic as long as they didn't publicly, kind of flout their authority to other people, including at home. So they let, for example, the person who opens the book, they allowed him to stay with his family, even though they knew that he was a heretic and was breaking all kinds of Jewish laws. But because he didn't do them publicly where they could see, they allowed him to keep his children in yeshiva. They allowed him to stay. So there's a kind of flexibility that I didn't expect. I think the parallel that's most interesting is with shtisel, because the main character, Akiva, he doesn't fit in, right? He has these dreams of being an artist, and he's creative in certain kinds of ways. And in fact, there were a lot of people who wanted to be Yiddish writers that I spoke with, who similarly were artists. There's a place for people like that, I think. But what interested me in shtisel is that he never really doubted religiously. Like, he had opportunities to, and he didn't quite fit in, and yet he stayed, and he didn't seem to have life-changing doubt. I thought that was a really sensitive portrayal of the kinds of ways that you could not fit in, and yet that doesn't mean everything falls away. The people I was working with, it did. And so they were quite different. And finally, One of Us, the documentary, which is a real interesting documentary, working also with Footsteps, I think, shows people who had to leave because either of spousal abuse, because of homosexuality. There was some drug abuse in one case. In my experience, people who are queer leave more often. That's what I heard. And most of the people I worked with were not, because it's so lonely, and usually earlier and you can leave before you get married. The really troubling piece for the people I worked with was they were married and they had been more or less on board with the system, and then it all fell apart, and that's what made it so difficult. And there were people over the course, because I did my research for about 5 or 6 years, there were people who did get divorced. 1 or 2 people left. The majority stayed, but they became increasingly public in their showing to the communities that they were changing, but just enough, always just pushing the envelope so that they didn't get kicked out and excommunicated, but showing that they were changing inside nonetheless.
Wow. Ayala, thank you so much. I can't believe we're already out of time. We went over a little, but this has been an amazing, amazing conversation. I encourage everybody, again, to purchase the book, Hidden Heretics. It's in the chat function. You could see where to go purchase it with a discount that we've been given from Ayala. And I also want to bring everyone's attention to more conversations that we're actually having this week on the B'Yachad platform about this topic. Tomorrow we will have our president, Jeffrey Herbst, will be in conversation with Rabbi Menachem Posner about Chabad as disruptors. So that's going to be really interesting. And then we have on the 22nd, we have Rabbi Sherry Hirsch will be in conversation with Naomi Seidman and Shana Hammerman about the topic of why the obsession with Haredi Judaism, which, you know, I think we see with all the people on the call today that people are really interested about this topic. And on Thursday, we actually have our president again in conversation with the writer of Shtisel, Ori Alan, and Ayelet Zurur, who played Elisheva Rothstein in the first season. So we have a lot of interesting conversations, as well as we just announced we're going to have a conversation with Jeff Schwartz, who was an NFL player, talking about his experiences in the NFL and anti-Semitism. So I invite everyone to go to our website, AJU.edu, B'yachad Together. Again, Ayala, thank you again. This has been just a treat for me to get to know you, to read the book, to discover mutual people that we know, and hopefully we'll get you on a conversation about language and how interesting it is. And thank you again, everybody, for being here today. We really appreciate your being with us, and we hope to see you again. Stay safe, everyone. And again, thank you, American Jewish University, for this fabulous platform. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.